President Trump's seventh cabinet meeting of this term saw the president addressing a variety of topics.
Yes, he talked about the economy, he talked about crime, and he also talked about abuse of power accusations.
Our country's in incredible shape.
Supreme Court and the role that this term of the Supreme Court will play in deciding really important policies and President Trump's agenda. Remember that, in a system of government like the U.S., the courts play a large role. And there's been a lot of question about what role this Supreme Court in particular will play in either supporting, if you will, or pushing back on President Trump's agenda.
Yeah, I think this is one of the underlying themes of his presidency. So much of his policy rests on court challenges to executive orders and letting some of these policies play out as they're challenged in the court. And as you said, Sumi, this term in particular is full of high stakes political confrontations. And we're going to see this court wade through cases that will determine the extent and the scope of his presidential power.
One focus of the meeting, the president's crackdown on crime after sending armed National Guard troops to the nation's capital. And this announcement.
If somebody kills somebody in the Capitol, Washington, D.C., we're going to be seeking the death penalty.
Now the president is threatening to send troops to other cities, including Baltimore and Chicago. The Windy City mayor fighting back.
This president in the federal government has literally declared war on poor people. I remember a time when presidents declared war on poverty.
Meanwhile, the president also acknowledging the criticism that he is abusing his power.
So the line is that I'm a dictator, but I stop crime. So a lot of people say, if that's the case, I'd rather have a dictator.
Okay, so let me ask you something. When you woke up this morning, did you think you'd see the Supreme Court basically slap down a sitting president? Yeah, me neither. But that's exactly what just happened. And honestly, the fallout is absolutely insane. So here's what went down. President Trump just got hit with what some people are calling the biggest judicial smackdown of his entire presidency. And look, I know we've heard that before, right? But this time it's different. Because we're not talking about some random federal judge in a blue state. We're talking about the Supreme Court, his Supreme Court, the one with 3 justices he literally appointed. Let that sink in for a second. This isn't just any court decision. This is the highest court in the land, telling a president to back off. And when that happens, especially with justices he personally selected, something major just went down. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. Yesterday, October 13th, the court issued what's called a preliminary injunction. And before your eyes glaze over, because that sounds boring, let me tell you what that actually means. It means they looked at what Trump was doing and said, yeah, no, stop, right now. They didn't schedule a hearing for next month. They didn't ask for more briefs. They just shut it down immediately. And what exactly did they shut down? Well, Trump signed an executive order that would have massively expanded government surveillance powers. We're talking about surveillance without the usual legislative approval, without Congress signing off, without the checks and balances that, the entire Constitution is built on. Just boom, executive order, done deal. Except it wasn't a done deal. Can you believe this? The Supreme Court calling out executive overreach in real time. And the internet, oh man, the internet exploded. Within 24 hours, the hashtag not above the law hit 800,000 posts. That's not a typo. 800,000 people weighing in on this. Political influencers, watchdog groups, random people who usually don't even pay attention to politics. Everyone was talking about it. And then Chief Justice John Roberts came out with a statement. Now, Roberts is not exactly known for being dramatic. This is a guy who usually keeps things pretty buttoned up. But yesterday, he went there. He said, and I'm quoting here, "No president is above the law. The Constitution's separation of powers is not optional." Not optional. Come on. That's about as close as you're going to get to a Supreme Court Chief Justice saying, hey, you're going too far, buddy. This is wild. When the Chief Justice feels compelled to make a public statement like this, we're in unprecedented territory. Now, predictably, the White House fired back. They put out a statement saying the order was necessary for national security, because of course they did. That's been the go-to justification for everything lately. National security, emergency powers, imminent threats. It's the same playbook we've seen over and over again. But here's the thing. Here's what makes this story absolutely explosive right now. We're not in some random month, in some random year. We're 10 months away from the 2026 midterms. 10 months. And this entire showdown, this battle over executive power, over constitutional limits, over whether one person can just decide to expand surveillance without asking permission. This is happening right as voters are starting to pay attention to what's going on in Washington. The timing couldn't be more politically charged if someone had planned it that way. And look, whether you love Trump or you can't stand him, you have to admit this is a massive story. Because it's not just about one executive order, it's about something way bigger. It's about the limits of presidential power. It's about whether the Supreme Court is still willing to check the executive branch, even when it's loaded with justices from the same political party. It's about whether the Constitution still means what it says, or whether we're just winging it now. So where does this go from here? Well, that's what we're going to dig into, because this isn't just a one-day news story that fades away by tomorrow. This is the kind of thing that has serious long-term consequences for Trump, for the court, for how much power future presidents think they can grab, for all of us, really. And the timing? Are you kidding me? The timing couldn't be more intense, because right now, as we speak, there are debates raging about immigration policy, about executive orders bypassing Congress, about whether Trump is a strong leader making tough calls, or whether he's systematically dismantling the checks and balances that are supposed to keep any president, Republican or Democrat, from having too much power. This is not a drill. This is happening, and it's happening fast. So buckle up, because we're about to break down exactly what this Supreme Court decision means, why it matters so much right now, and what it could mean for the future of presidential power in America. This is going to get interesting. We're going to explore not just the immediate implications, but the long-term ramifications for American democracy itself. Because when the highest court in the land steps in to block a president's executive order this quickly and this forcefully, it sends shockwaves through the entire political system. And those shockwaves are just beginning to be felt. The next few weeks and months are going to be absolutely critical in determining how this plays out, and whether this moment becomes a footnote in history or a defining turning point in how executive power is understood and exercised in America. All right, so let's dig into this, because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, Trump tried to do something. The court said no. What's the big deal? Doesn't this happen all the time? And yeah, technically, presidents get challenged in court all the time. That's normal. That's how the system works. But this is different. And here's why. First of all, let's talk about what this executive order actually does. Because the White House has been pretty vague about the details, which, come on, is never a good sign, right? But from what we know, this order would have given federal agencies way more authority to conduct surveillance. And we're not just talking about like keeping an eye on suspected terrorists. We're talking about broad surveillance powers that could potentially be used on American citizens without the usual warrants, without the usual oversight. The scope of what was being proposed here is genuinely staggering when you really think about it. Now, the administration says this is all about national security. They're saying there are threats out there that require quick action, that Congress moves too slow, that by the time you get legislative approval, the bad guys have already done whatever they were planning to do. And look, I get that argument. I really do. There are real threats out there. Nobody's denying that. But here's where it gets messy. Because the Constitution, that document everyone swears an oath to uphold, is pretty clear about how this is supposed to work. The executive branch enforces laws. The legislative branch makes laws. The judicial branch interprets laws. It's literally called separation of powers. And the whole point, the entire reason the founders set it up this way, was to make sure no single person or branch could just do whatever they wanted. They had just fought a war against a king who had absolute power, and they were determined to create a system where that could never happen again in America. And Trump, he's been pushing against those boundaries since day one of his second term, actually since day one of his first term, if we're being honest. Executive orders on immigration, executive orders on trade, executive orders on trade, executive orders on environmental policy, and every time the argument is the same: Congress won't act, so I have to, or this is an emergency, we don't have time for the normal process. But at what point does emergency just become the new normal? At what point are we just accepting that the president can bypass Congress whenever it's inconvenient to go through the proper channels? Because that's a really dangerous road to go down. History is full of examples of democracies that slowly eroded, not through dramatic coups, but through incremental expansions of executive power. Each step seems reasonable in isolation, but when you look at the cumulative effect over years or decades, you realize the system has fundamentally changed. And that's what a lot of constitutional scholars are worried about right now. And the Supreme Court clearly agrees. That's what makes this decision so significant. They looked at this order and said, nope, this crosses the line. This is executive overreach. And they used that exact phrase, executive overreach. They didn't sugarcoat it. They didn't say, well, we have some concerns, but let's see how it plays out. They shut it down immediately with a preliminary injunction. Do you know how rare that is for the Supreme Court to move that fast? They usually take forever. They schedule oral arguments. They deliberate. They release opinions months later, but this time, they basically hit the emergency brake, which tells you they thought this was serious. When the Supreme Court acts with this kind of urgency, it's because they believe the threat to constitutional principles is immediate and severe. They saw something in this executive order that alarmed them enough to bypass their usual cautious, deliberative process and act decisively. And then you have Chief Justice Roberts making a public statement. Again, this almost never happens. Supreme Court justices don't usually go around making proclamations to the press, but Roberts felt strongly enough about this to say it out loud. No president is above the law. That line right there, that's going to be quoted for years because it's a direct shot across the bow. Is Roberts saying, we don't care how much power you think you have. We don't care how many justices you appointed. There are still limits, and we're going to enforce them. Roberts has always positioned himself as an institutionalist, someone who cares deeply about preserving the legitimacy and authority of the Supreme Court as an institution. And when he sees something that threatens the fundamental constitutional order, he's willing to speak out, even if it means publicly rebuking a president from his own ideological coalition. That's how serious he views this situation. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. Because you think, right, that Trump's appointees would be on his side. You think Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett would be like, yeah, the president needs these powers. Let's back him up. But according to reports, the injunction was issued without any public dissent, which means it's possible this was unanimous or close to it. Let me say that again. Trump's own Supreme Court justices might have voted against him on this. Now, we don't know for sure because preliminary injunctions don't always come with detailed opinions. But the fact that there's no recorded dissent is telling. It suggests that even the conservative justices looked at this and said, yeah, this is too much. And that's what has everyone freaking out right now. Because if you can't even count on your own appointees to back you up on executive power grabs, then where does that leave you? It leaves you looking like you pushed too far, like you miscalculated. Like maybe, just maybe, you're not as untouchable as you thought. So then the White House scrambles and puts out this statement about national security. And look, I don't want to be cynical, but national security has become the magic phrase that's supposed to shut down all debate. Someone criticizes an executive order, national security. Someone questions a surveillance program, national security. It's like the ultimate trump card, no pun intended. But people aren't buying it this time because we've heard it too many times. And at a certain point, you start to wonder, is this really about protecting the country? Or is it about expanding presidential power as much as possible while you're in office? The national security justification has been used and overused so many times in recent decades that it's starting to lose its persuasive power. People are more skeptical now. They want to see actual evidence of threats, not just vague assertions that something is necessary for security reasons. And when the administration can't or won't provide those specifics, it raises even more questions about whether this is really about security or about power. And that's the question driving the conversation online right now. That hashtag not above the law. It's not just liberals and Democrats piling on. There are constitutional conservatives in there too, libertarians, people who are genuinely worried about executive overreach, regardless of which party is in power. Because here's the thing, whatever powers Trump grabs now, those powers don't just disappear when he leaves office. The next president gets them too, and the one after that, and the one after that. So if you're cool with Trump having massive surveillance powers without congressional approval, you better be okay with the next Democratic president having those same powers, because that's how precedent works. That's how executive authority expands. One president pushes the boundary, the next one pushes it a little further, and before you know it, the boundaries don't really exist anymore. This is a ratchet effect in action, and it's something that should concern anyone who cares about constitutional governance, regardless of their partisan affiliation. This is why this case matters so much. It's not just about this one executive order. It's about whether we're still operating under a constitutional system with real checks and balances, or whether we've evolved into something else. Something where the president can just declare an emergency and do whatever they want. And the Supreme Court just said no, not on our watch. The Constitution still means something. Separation of powers still matters. And yes, even the president has limits. The reaction has been predictable, but intense. Trump supporters are saying the court is obstructing necessary security measures, that they're playing politics, that they're undermining the president's ability to keep Americans safe, because it sets the tone for how much Trump can push executive authority during the rest of his term. And it sends a message to future presidents about where the line is. And all of this is happening, like I said, 10 months before the midterms. So voters are watching, Congress is watching, and you can bet that this is going to become a major campaign issue. Democrats are going to run on we need to restore checks and balances. Republicans are going to have to decide whether they defend Trump's actions or distance themselves from executive overreach. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's absolutely fascinating. The political calculations happening right now in both parties are incredibly complex. Republican members of Congress are trying to figure out how to navigate this without either alienating Trump's base or appearing to support unconstitutional actions. Democratic candidates are trying to use this as evidence that they need to win more seats to provide proper oversight. And independent voters are watching all of this, trying to figure out what it means for the country's future. Okay, so let's bring this all together, because I know there's a lot of information flying around and it's easy to get lost in the legal jargon and the political spin. So let me break this down into the key points you actually need to understand. Point number 1, what exactly happened? Trump signed an executive order expanding surveillance powers. The Supreme Court immediately blocked it with a preliminary injunction. Chief Justice Roberts made a public statement emphasizing that no president is above the law. The White House defended the order as necessary for national security, and social media exploded with debate. That's the basic timeline. It's straightforward when you strip away all the noise and just focus on the sequence of events. But as we've seen, the implications of this straightforward sequence are anything but simple. Point number 2, why this matters more than your typical legal challenge. Because this isn't just any court, this is the Supreme Court. And this isn't just any decision. This is them moving fast, unusually fast, to stop what they saw as executive overreach. They used strong language. Roberts made a rare public statement, and there's no indication that Trump's own appointees sided with him. All of that signals that this crossed a line, a big line. And here's the thing, executive power has been expanding for decades, under presidents from both parties. Little by little, the executive branch has been taking on more authority, using more executive orders, finding more ways to act without congressional approval. And every time it happens, people say, well, that's just how modern government works. You can't expect Congress to handle everything. But at some point, you have to ask, where does it stop? If the president can expand surveillance without legislative approval, what else can they do? Can they redirect military funding without Congress? Can they rewrite regulations without going through the proper rulemaking process? Can they just govern by decree? Because that's not a hypothetical question anymore. That's what we're dealing with. And the Supreme Court just said there are still limits, there are still boundaries, and they're willing to enforce them. This decision represents a potential turning point in the long trajectory of expanding executive power. It's the court saying, we've watched this trend continue for long enough, and we're drawing a line here. Whether this line holds, whether it becomes a permanent feature of constitutional law, or just a temporary speed bump, that remains to be seen. But for now, in this moment, the court has made its position clear, and that clarity is important, even if the ultimate outcome is still uncertain. Point number 3, the political fallout is just beginning. Right now, we're in the immediate reaction phase. People are tweeting, commentators are giving hot takes, the White House is defending itself. But the real consequences, those are going to play out over the next several months. Because this decision weakens Trump's ability to act unilaterally, it emboldens his critics, it gives ammunition to Democrats heading into the midterms, and it puts congressional Republicans in an awkward position because they have to decide, do they defend Trump's actions and risk looking like they don't care about constitutional limits, or do they break with the president and risk alienating his base? It's a no-win situation for a lot of lawmakers, and you can bet they're all scrambling right now to figure out their messaging. Behind closed doors, there are intense conversations happening about strategy, about how to thread the needle between principle and politics. And then there's the impact on Trump himself. Look, love him or hate him, Trump's political brand has always been about strength, about not backing down, about fighting the system, but getting publicly rebuked by the Supreme Court, that doesn't exactly project strength. That looks like he overplayed his hand, like he pushed too far and got slapped down. Now, will that hurt him politically? Maybe, maybe not. His supporters might see this as more evidence that the establishment is out to get him. But swing voters, independent voters, people who are already nervous about executive overreach, this might push them in the other direction. The perception of strength versus weakness is crucial to Trump's political identity, and this ruling challenges that perception in ways that could have lasting consequences. It's not just about this one decision, it's about the narrative that forms around it, the story that gets told about what this means. Point number 4, this sets a precedent that goes way beyond Trump. Here's what a lot of people are missing. This case isn't really about Trump. I mean, yes, obviously it's about his executive order, but the legal precedent being set here, that affects every future president, Republican or Democrat. If the Supreme Court draws a clear line on executive authority, if they establish that certain actions require congressional approval, no matter what emergency the president claims, that limits what every future president can do. And depending on your perspective, that's either a really good thing or a really bad thing. Conservatives who want a strong executive are not happy about this. They see it as the court tying the president's hands, making it harder to respond to threats, creating bureaucratic obstacles that put the country at risk. And they have a point. There are situations where you need quick action, where waiting for Congress would be a disaster. But people worried about authoritarianism, they're relieved because unchecked executive power is dangerous. It doesn't matter whether you trust the current president, the next president inherits those same powers, and history is full of examples of how that can go wrong. So this decision is bigger than one executive order. It's about the fundamental structure of American government, about whether separation of powers still means anything, about whether we're still a nation of laws, or whether we've become a nation where the person in charge can do whatever they want as long as they invoke national security. And the Supreme Court just voted for the former. They voted for constitutional limits. They voted for checks and balances. And regardless of your politics, that's significant. It's a reaffirmation of principles that have been under strain for a long time. Whether this reaffirmation holds up under future pressure, whether it marks a genuine restoration of constitutional balance, or just a momentary pause in the expansion of executive power, only time will tell. So, where do we go from here? Well, Trump could try to rewrite the executive order. He could work with Congress to get legislative approval for the surveillance expansion, or he could dig in and fight this battle publicly, using it as a rallying cry for his base. The Supreme Court could issue a more detailed opinion explaining their reasoning. They could hear oral arguments and make this an even bigger case, or they could just let the injunction stand and move on. And Congress could finally step up and clarify the limits of executive authority. They could pass legislation defining what presidents can and can't do with executive orders. But let's be real, given the current state of Congress, that seems unlikely. The dysfunction and paralysis that characterizes the current legislative branch makes it hard to imagine them taking decisive action on anything, let alone something this constitutionally significant and politically fraught. What's certain is that this story isn't over. It's just beginning. Because this fight over executive power is the fight of our time. It's what's going to define American democracy for the next generation. And 10 months before the midterms, with Trump in the White House and the Supreme Court willing to push back, we're about to see just how much power one person can have in our system. And whether the checks and balances we learned about in civics class are still real, or whether they become just a nice idea that doesn't actually matter anymore, the Supreme Court just said they're real, they matter, and they're not going anywhere. So yeah, this is wild, this is historic, and this is absolutely something you need to be paying attention to, because what happens next could reshape American government for decades. And that's where we'll pick up next time. Because trust me, this story is far from over.